Alright, welcome back. This is M-Dog, and we are still over here float fishing, but that's not all we're doing. As you see, we're catching some big-headed carp here, and I'm just sort of experimenting, trying to figure out like a good combination of a fun way to still be working on float fishing, but also at the same time catching some pretty nice fish. Again, trying to combine what's fun as well as still making pretty decent silver and still trying to work on float fishing. I am starting to worry that I've sort of fished this spot out, or this spot is maybe changing. I'm just not seeing the same species that I was the last couple of days. I don't mean in-game days, I mean real life days. I've been doing this for a couple days here off and on, both in this spot as well as that spot down that I showed you in the last video with the sticklebacks and loach. So I don't know. As far as the float fishing goes, I mean, it's still okay. And I've been working on like trying to change depths up. Now we are at the sort of coming out of that afternoon time where the fishing is a little slower anyway. And I'm hoping we'll have a fish on down the river here. We're fishing with carp rods. I mentioned doing a little bit of experimentation on. Anyway, I made my own PVA. The VK site is where I got this bighead carp spot, but they did not have. It was all in Russian. I couldn't see what the PVA was. But the more you use PVA, it really, honestly, it kind of becomes easier to sort of get a sense of what probably would make sense. The main thing is just using different additives to complement the boilies you're using, and an attractant to be pretty directly complementary of the boilies you're using. And so some of it is just kind of like, okay, what base is working good this week or recently? All right, there's a Kessler's herring. I don't hear our little bells going off, but I'm anxious to go show you where we're catching the big heads, but we'll try to be a little patient here. This is where we are, of course, with float fishing. If you didn't see my last video on this spot, this is still in the same spot, just experimenting with different depths and hook sizes, basically trying to see what all we can come up with. And that is really, for silver at least, that is what we want, these nice black spine herrings. I also go back and forth between this spot and then basically like 3 or 4 steps down. If one of the two seems to go dry, or I seem to just be catching roach all of a sudden, then I'll kind of walk down a few steps and try it down there. So let's see if I'll go down and show you the carp spot. And I don't want to necessarily make this video be super long, but ideally you kind of want to, and by the way, if you want to level your float fishing more and worry less about the carp, then use more float rods and less carp rods. I mean, you can have a total of 3 out. So right now I've got 1 float, 2 carp, but you could go 2 float, 1 carp. I think can be still pretty good. The bite rate down there with the big head seems to be pretty decent. Especially in the morning, it was really nice. I think if you, I've sort of been distracted, been getting up, doing lots of different things around the house, but if you were really focused on float fishing during the day consistently, as well as having your carp rods in, and then at night I would go to just 3 carp rods. You don't really want to float fish here in the evening because the eyed is mostly the only thing you're going to catch, and they're just too big for these little 3.2 liters. But you can end up putting together a pretty decent 24 hours of fishing between the little fish we're catching on float as well as the carp. Kessler's herring. Yeah, and the only thing with the Kessler's herring, I think I've got a 19 hook on right now, but I kind of go back and forth between 18 to 20. But the Kessler's herring, out of all the fish we're catching in that spot, seem to be the least likely to be markers. Let's see if we have an eyed on either one of these. And maybe we've just hit, again, that slower afternoon portion. So we'll give them a little bit more time. Yeah. So here we're about 17 meter clipped. This is where we are on the map. 51, 138. And the baits we're using here are sinking boilies, squid and octopus 15 with craft baits caviar 16. I think you could do the squid dip and be fine. For now, I'm sort of leaning into the black caviar for dip, and that seems to be working well. And then I've got sort of my own mixture of a squid and caviar PVA. I think there's a couple of changes I might make if I do another round of this. I just made one batch of PVA to do some testing here. The attractant, again, I went with squid, but I think you could just as easily go with caviar for this spot. But I think you could lean more heavily into squid in terms of what additives you use as well, and maybe match the dip with that. So it's just sort of trying to decide which way you want to go with that, but I'm imagining both of those are going to work good. And before we go get a little bit more float fishing on, let's see if this turns into a bite here. Normally I use the blinkers, of course, but I actually need the audio cues to let me know when a fish is on, since I'm float fishing just down the bank. Alright, maybe we can get you a good fish here. If it's this small, it's most likely an eyed or a really small bighead carp. Yeah, it's a small carp, so not even a marker on that one. We had one really big one that I had on 29 break. It was still running a little bit, and then of course it popped off. But like I said, I just haven't been here long, and the bite rate's been really good on the bighead. Eyed. At least two of these eyed were caught down here in this spot. Some of the eyed I'm catching down here, unfortunately, on the mayflies as well. So let's get a couple more float fishing in, and then see if we can at least see one more big head or something down there for you before we wrap this video up. But this seems like a pretty fun combination. Curious to hear if you all have any fun spots where you're enjoying leveling up float fishing. I know that not the easy answer, but a common strategy when we're leveling up float fishing is just to go to winding, or even Belaya recently has been good, and just kind of load up on bait fish and stuff like that. But I get so tired of that. I'm just sort of always looking for spots where you can see some maybe a little bit more interesting fish. And then especially if you can be float fishing pretty successfully nearby somewhere where you can also be catching some nice fish on bottom, on feeder fishing or carp fishing. So this has been a pretty good spot for that. I think we're down to 90 centimeters depth, which means I probably want to have it a little closer to the shore. The more we go out to that distance, the more I feel like maybe we want to have the, 1.2, 1.3 meter depth. Yeah. All right, let's go a little closer in. The way the current works here, it's just going to move further from the bank. So if you're going to do this, if you want it to be close to the shore at all, you sort of have to start really close, right on the edge of that green stuff. Still no wear to our Blade Master 700. I was curious as we started to use this how quickly we might see some wear start to show up, but thankfully none yet. Let's see if we get anything interesting down this far. I believe I may need to let this spot rest. And it could be that just the amount of time I've spent fishing here, but again, it also could be that this spot is changing. I originally came here catching Shemaya. I haven't seen Shemaya in in-game days though. It's all herring, occasionally like rudd, significant amount of roach as well. I know we've got bells going off down there, but let's see if we can go a little deeper. It's getting a little later. Let's go to 1.3 meters and we'll go back out a little bit farther. Just want to try to get one more fish on float here before we head down and finish up with our carp rods. And I do think, I'm not sure if the bite rate will be quite as good overnight as it was in the morning down there with the carp rods, but I do think nighttime is when you often see some of the trophies come out, especially the eyed down there. We can see some really large eyed come out, and same with the big-headed carp. And you'll occasionally on those baits, because we have the fishy type baits, you may even see some sterlet or sturgeon come through, but that's not what we're relying upon. Mostly what we're thinking, that we're going to see is going to be the big heads and the eyed, and the occasional other fish. Yeah, I'm just not getting the bite frequency here on floats that I was before. So I really may have to I may have to let this spot rest or go try some other float spots here on tuba. But it does kind of mess up my plan to pair this with the carp spot. Okay, let's go check out the carp. And so what I would do at this time of night, might float fish for another in-game hour or so typically, but the eyed are going to start showing up, and so we want to be ready to go ahead and get our third one out here. Same setup as the other two, 17 meter clip. Just kind of get that out there, and we've got all kinds of action here. I'm trying to see if either one of them looks like they're pulling larger than the other one. Yeah, it's a big head. I think we're going to catch a lot of big head in this spot, which I'm fine with. They are decent silver and experience. They definitely add up. And by the way, on the float fishing, it also could be weather. I mean, there's a lot of variables that could be changing what I'm getting there. Okay, another decent big head. And then hopefully at night we'll get some good ones. Okay, so again, this is 51-138, just down the shore, up the river here from the float spot, and 17 clip. And yeah, I think it's good. I think this is a nice little big head carp spot. Primarily, that's what we're seeing. But like I said, I think if you stay here for a little while, from what I'm seeing on the VK site, you will occasionally get some nice eyed, and other fish will come in as well. So, but primarily we're seeing these big heads, and this time of day is when you'd expect maybe to get a special one every once in a while. So we'll get this last fish in, and then I will wrap it up. But as always, I appreciate you being here, and let me know if you've been working on your float fishing lately, if you've got any favorite spots, because obviously I need to let this float spot rest. I will see you next time. Thanks a lot.